Welcome, friends, and welcome to week 1. This is lecture 4, and this will be the last lecture of this week. Whatever we don't finish up this week, we will get to at the beginning of next week. But I don't want to inundate you with too much material because you have these 4 lectures and the interview to watch, as well as the beginning of this class to launch into. So I know you've already got a lot on your plate, but I do want to bring a little bit more clarity to what we've been talking about thus far. I've introduced to you this week a missional hermeneutic, a way of understanding that the church has this unique posture and purpose and orientation to the world for the sake of the kingdom of God. It's incumbent upon every person who calls themselves a follower of Jesus to live into that unique identity. We then made the shift to discuss and to talk about what a hermeneutic is, what it means to approach the scriptures as the art of interpreting for the people of God this unique opportunity to see within the scriptures God's redemptive design and purposes. And then in the last lecture, we started with, it's good. When God creates all things out of nothing, he makes them, and it is good. What if the God who created them to be good has longed that he would one day again say, boy, that's good. This God who has never given up on the restorative, redemptive, and reconciliatory purposes of a God who stays in the fray amid human character's fragility and our fickleness in our decisions and assumptions that we make about what our life should look like. And that fickleness and fragility works itself out in some incredibly devastating ways. But God stays in the fray. God doesn't give up. God doesn't move on and say, you know what, I'm done with humanity. God continues to work providentially out of love and purposefully within the context of humanity's ups and downs, ebbs and flows, and moments of immense faithfulness and deep failure to fulfill his purposes. God is at work in this world doing something. And the something that God is at work doing, he's constantly partnering with humanity. He partnered with this early family of Abraham. He partners with the people of Israel and says, you, out of all of the nations, are to represent me faithfully amongst all of creation. But it'll be that calling that Israel will struggle to hold on to throughout most of its journey. It will struggle to understand that the law that God institutes is much like a composer would give a score to its orchestra to say, hey, you want to make beautiful songs, beautiful melody? Play this score. We say, no, I'm going to write my own music. I'm going to do my own thing. And they start playing their instruments of their lives in whatever ways that they want to, not recognizing or understanding the importance and the value of what God intends for the people of God as they represent his purposes in the world. We see this decisively as Israel is brought through the desert and then lands themselves in the promised land, as God makes space for them. Now, this in of itself is a unique moment for us to explore that I'll pick up maybe later on in the lectures. But how ought we make sense of the missional context of the conquest narratives of Joshua and Judges? That's a complex set of questions. But Israel finds themselves in this promised land, commissioned with this vocation of living faithfully amongst all of the neighbors, what God had created and intended for them. But by the time we get to the beginning of 1 Samuel, which, again, when we're talking about a missional hermeneutic, it's important for us to recognize that many biblical scholars believe that Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings is written from a prophetic perspective. And what I mean by that is that the prophetic perspective, the prophetic hermeneutic of reading back and interpreting those stories is always through the lens of calling into question our assumptions of establishment, our assumptions of power, of privilege, of prominence, of prosperity. It seems to want to call into question the ways in which humanity is allured from its unique vocation as God bearers in this world. Okay, so I think we need to realize, but at the beginning of 1 Samuel, the people are done. They're like, they've had it with the precariousness of living under the daily faithfulness of God. They look around at all the nations and they see the stability, they see the standing militaries, they see the coffers full, and they say, you know what, we want a leader that will lead us like they lead us. And this is a unique moment. It's a unique moment in the history of Israel when Israel not only surrenders its vocation, but surrenders its commitment to Yahweh. Surrenders its belief that the Yahweh is the one through whom their destiny will be forged, and through whom the blessings that were promised to Abraham will be realized in this community for the sake of the world. They assimilate and want to become like everyone around them. And God warns them, when you get that kind of leader, he's going to lead you down paths that are going to be imperial, hierarchical, and tyrannical and authoritarian, because that's the way it happens when we give too much power to any group of human beings. That we were all supposed to live under the kingship, lordship, leadership of God as a community, rather than looking for the powers and the principalities of this world to provide a safety that we're not certain that God can provide for us. And in a sense, they abandoned that alternative contrast community kind of posture that they were supposed to have in this world. And they begin to go down a path that leads them further and further from the vocation to which God had called them. And I think that's so important for us to understand, that anytime we saddle ourselves too tightly with power and prosperity and privilege, we move further and further from the self-giving holy love of God that moves into this world to inspire radical transformation and change through a community that refuses to look like the world around it, and takes within itself this brilliant, beautiful, bold, and big calling of representing God's redemptive purposes. Now, here's the powerful thing, is that God isn't again done or dissuaded from his purposes to bring redemption. God gets in the fray. God says, okay, if you're going to pick a king, I'm at least going to pick him. And so God seeks to raise up kings that will, in whatever imperfect ways, continue to reflect God in his world. And then we see how power begins to divide, how the privileged continue to flourish, how the marginalized are taken advantage of, how the poor are being deceived and tricked, and injustice are settling in at deep levels. We begin to recognize and see all of the very things that God says this will happen when you are no longer okay with the constraints of your humanity and continue to try to be something I didn't intend for you to be. We see the outcomes. But God raises up, dispatches, and sends out prophets who will call into question the assumptions of power, the assumptions of privilege, the assumptions of prosperity, the assumptions of militarism, the assumptions of our ends justify our means, and the assumptions of a world that no longer seeks to care for the most vulnerable amongst them. One of the things that we need to recognize about a missional hermeneutic is this consistent motif of God raising up and sending out, dispatching and deploying his servants into the world to again call the world into account for its failure to represent God's intended purposes, to bear in their own bodies an example of what that witness needs to look like. And I think this is a motif that we can never forget, we can never underestimate, we can never invalidate. That there is this prophetic nature of the church. This is why the church can't so easily side with any one group, because we've got to maintain the prophetic distance to be able to name in this world when we are out of alignment with God's redemptive, reclaiming, and restorative purposes in this world, as God is seeking to reconcile the world to himself and to one another. So God raises up these prophets and calls into account power. And power, and again, I'm not going to go into the whole of the story. You can see that in the garden to the city. But power devolves into this division. This division creates vulnerability. And the people of Israel, this people who were called and created to be that kind of people, a people through whom God's blessings of purpose and redemption were to move through for the sake of the whole world, has found themselves no longer uniquely positioned to fulfill that vocation, now finding themselves under the oppression of other governments, and other powers, and other principalities, first in Assyria, then in Babylon, then among the Greeks and the Romans. And so the question is, how does God continue to move forward? How is God going to continue to lean into this redemptive purpose? Or is God just finished with it? But I don't know that that's the case, because I think as we pay attention to the grand scope and the narrative of Scripture, that we need to remember that God, the God who said it is good, wants to say it is good again. And God doesn't give up quickly on God's purposes. God stays true to God's self. Reading the Scriptures missionally is to recognize that the character of God is unwavering in the purposes of redemption, restoration, and reclamation. That God is seeking to fulfill in this world for the sake of his purposes. Now, he's going to raise someone up. He's going to send someone out. He's going to dispatch someone or someones for the sake of continuing that good work. God partners with humanity for the sake of bringing dynamic transformation within the world today. Not just somewhere else down the road once we punch our ticket and move on to our heavenly destination, but a world in which the advent of God's restorative purposes and redemptive purposes is recognized in a kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And when we make that shift to that promise of that kingdom, we make our shift into that new embrace of what it means to be God's missional people in this world, which we'll pick up at the beginning of week 2 as we finish out our missional hermeneutic, but then also begin to move towards a missional ecclesiology that I think transforms our way of understanding the purposes and postures of the church in this world. No longer do we exist for the sake of ourselves, but we exist as those raised up, sent out, dispatched, and deployed to bear witness to the uniqueness of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And we will talk more in week 2.